Okay, I'm not making this recording out of the best circumstances. I have limited time and I just want to start producing this thought catalogue before this content sort of gets displaced by other issues that I'm dealing with. So, yeah, I mean, I'm very depressed looking at the cultural landscape. There's opportunity for progress within the culture war, if I can put it like that. But I think that it's unlikely uh, that the positive synthesis, or the most robust and rigorous synthesis, is going to take place. It seems to me that a half-baked synthesis is going to take place, and this is likely to create the kind of environment in which, I mean, I've already predicted that we are largely reliving the 1920s Weimar Germany, that liberal ideals, libertarian philosophy is being displaced by a very malicious kind of groupthink, and when it looks like that it's being challenged, what it's actually doing is that it's taking more prominent hold of the more conscious part of our culture. It is actually it is coming further to the tip of people's tongues, the common person's tongue, if I can make that kind of um, low resolution generalization or metaphor. But let me be particular about what I'm referring to. So the Whoopi Goldberg, the View controversy, I think I want to talk about what my conclusion is on this, but I first have to describe it, I guess, and I don't want people to. So let me just brute force get into all the elements that I think are at play here in no particular order. Whoopi Goldberg didn't say anything incorrect according to intersectional identity politics or according to critical race theory. All she did was properly defend and articulate the critical race theory line of argument. Now, the problem is that line of argument is a bit incoherent and is obviously kind of morally corrupt. But how it's being criticized by the right as anti-Semitism, or not, I shouldn't, not or the whole right. I think some people do wade into this, but they don't properly digest the moral principles, and they don't really get to the heart of this thing, because to get at the heart of this thing and to get into it is kind of, you have to say something quite strange. You have to say, Whoopi Goldberg's conclusion, part of her conclusion, is there's nothing wrong with it. It's just the reasoning is bad, and also it shows the no, you see, for me to explain this, I have to get into this. So, okay, let me kind of criticize the people who are calling this anti-Semitism. This is not anti-Semitism. To label what Whoopi Goldberg did anti-Semitism is to criticize Whoopi Goldberg from within the worldview of identity politics. If you call this anti-Semitism, you are criticizing Whoopi Goldberg from the left, not from conservatism or from traditional classical liberal values, or grounded philosophy or grounded morality. You are using and this is what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that if critical race theory gets put back in its box, which it is unlikely to be put back in its box anyway, because essentially because it just came up against the kind of the identity politics around people who label everything anti-Semitism. Not to say that there isn't such a thing as anti-Semitism, but very clearly in this circumstance, what was driving this is not anti-Semitism. And to even talk about anti-Semitism is to some extent, is to force people to live in your narrative worldview of identity politics. Man, I've opened up a huge can of worms that I want to attend to this afterwards. Let me get into the deep moral of the issue. I do think the whole Jewish cry around anti-Semitism lay the groundwork for a lot of identity politics, because people saw how easy it was to simply label someone as an anti-hyphen identity. Because if you just label someone as an anti-hyphen identity, you don't actually have to disagree with them. You don't actually have to dissect what it is that they're saying and get down to the actual disagreement. You just kind of lob a paradox at them that they have to think about it from the identitarian consciousness perspective. They need to think about it from the group of the other side. They need to inhabit the lived experience and the racial consciousness of some other group. So Whoopi Goldberg partly comes to the right conclusion, where she says this is man's inhumanity with man. The reason why it's so putrid when Whoopi Goldberg tries to make that kind of point is because she countenances that point within a broader context of her own racial consciousness, which she is obviously beholden to, and which she says, non-racialism is for white people, and she includes Jewish people as part of that. So, like everyone else, every other issue in the world can be seen in a non-racialist way, but her particular sacred victimhood of the black identity, that you actually have to live it through the history. You actually have to look it through the lived collective conscious experience of that identity. So she is leveraging a double standard. And if identity politics is going to crumble under the weight of its own double standard, because anti-Semitism and anti-blackness or black identity or whatever. If anti-racism falls because it's a house divided amongst itself within the left. So I mean, I don't want it to fall that way. I want it to fall because it is itself a call for a kind of authoritarian moral authority, which can just disguise all of its own intellectual dishonesty and disguise all of its own moral corruption by just basically saying, well, all other issues are basically non-racialist issues, except for this one. This one, everyone must live through the narrative of this identity, and everyone must underdog champion this identity claim, because this identity claim must be the one ring that binds us all into the general lowest common denominator solution to everything. So we must all saddle ourselves with this rationalization or scope or view of systemic oppression. That everything must be seen through the lens of systemic oppression as it applies pressure onto a racial consciousness or some kind of racial solidarity, or some kind of, that we must all rehabilitate the history thereof of one particular group. Because as soon as you're in that project, you no longer have democratic literacy, you no longer have an open liberal democracy, you no longer have democratic politics. Instead, you have demagoguery. And because you can always just externalize blame, and you can always just say, well, it's your fault for not being sensitive to this identitarian claim, which is exactly what happens every time someone says anti-Semitism. Because when you're talking about anti-Semitism, you're talking about intentionality. And when you say that intentionality is coming from insensitivity, you've fucking created a paradox. You've created a moral paradox. Why call someone an anti-Semite when you can just say, well, you are obviously there's a historical effect which you're leaving out of your thinking, but in as much as that if you want to actually champion the non-racialist worldview, then your history is just you lack the education in history. But Whoopi Goldberg probably doesn't lack the education in history. What she lacks is the understanding that critical race theory and, let's say, the Black Lives Matter movement has radicalized her. She has done nothing wrong according to her leftist contingent of the echo chamber. That is the problem that Whoopi Goldberg represents, is not anti-Semitism, it's the problem of identity politics. And to try to conflate these two things is really to miss the entire beat on this. So when Ben Shapiro, says the term anti-Semitism when he's talking about this, I think he's a hypocrite. Because, how can you say that when at the same time you want essentially the the solidarity with the black identity movement, when you want that to stop being political, when you want that to stop having a kind of a partisan political agenda, like, it's not consistent. You can't call this anti-Semitism and be against Black Lives Matter. Essentially, I submit. Now, so I'm just pointing out that there is this chip on the shoulder of the Jewish identity, especially in America, where, look, I mean, to talk about, again, this thing, maybe you can refer to something that's relevant to talk about when you talk about anti-Semitism, because it's like any other kind of racism, essentially. So why not just talk about racism and talk about people who don't have the principled moral position of non-racialism? Why not talk about non-racialism then directly? Why label people anti-Semitic? Now, I do think that there is a category of anti-Semitism which is worth talking about, but it's not really relevant in the American context, and that has to do with the kind of Islamic, theocratic. Anyway, so that is a different case of anti-Semitism, because there is an ideology which is actually dependent on destroying the people that conform to the identity. The well, anyway. So that is a kind of that is a different case. Because I do think that is a form of anti-Semitism which actually manifests as directly. It's not a paradox. It's not a label that you put on people. Although, I guess some people would just say, well, I'm actually just believing in Islam, and Islam tells me that Israel must be wiped out. Like if that's their, that's their worldview or something like that, I would call. I think that there's an argument to be made that that's an anti-Semitic worldview. But that is a completely different kind of ball game, and I don't want to talk about it because it's not, quite frankly, it's not relevant. And I do think that if I can quite frankly say, historically, and I don't like generalizing about groups, but I do think that historically speaking, and this holds no moral water, I'm just making a historical point, I think Jews that have made this anti-Semitic construct such a big construct, as a kind of as a pressure release, as a panic button that they can push to get out of problematic situations, like maybe it was made for this point in time, that it could actually bring down the left under its own kind of superficial contradiction here, because it is the left is breeding overt black fascism. I mean, like, this is also okay. Sorry, I'm trying to talk about two things at the same time. Let me finish the. So I think that what's likely to come from this is more black identitarian consciousness is going to radicalize into overt fascism. I think that this brings the cultural temperature of the culture war into a much more conscious purview of the zeitgeist, and we will see perhaps people starting to develop more overtly the principle of the Führer. Because the only way to reconcile this kind of inconsistency is to develop the philosophy of the Führer. And so I think this is going to start, I mean, this has already happened de facto, but unconsciously, but now it's going to start becoming rationalized ideology. We're going to start seeing people that are going to say the only way to overcome this Whoopi Goldberg controversy is that we have to see that there is a rational space for someone to fulfill the role of the Führer, and someone has to burden this paradox of applying this political polemic on behalf of the racial consciousness. So this is going to lay the ground for a much more overt black fascist consciousness. That's going to be the one product of this. The other one is that other people are going to see that this is untenable, that it's incoherent, and they're going to choose the other side. They're going to say, look, this identity politics filth is fascism, it's trash, we need to get away from it. And it's going to scare them away from it. And they're going to choose that people are going to choose their sides essentially from this. But the problem is there's still so much cultural currency held that it's not going to radicalize fast enough. It's going to radicalize in this middling way where it's going to be half baked, and you're going to get more and more esoteric, Gestapo-esque, sort of cults, identitarian, like Antifa and stuff like that, and they are going to become much more racially the they're going to militate much more. You're going to have Antifa progress towards a much more overtly racialistic kind of model, where they might still have lots of people of different races in their ranks, but leadership positions are all going to be held by people of color and all that kind of stuff. It's going to the vindication of the identity is going to become much more crystallized or concretized in some. They're going to start developing the legwork of developing the religion of the Führer is going to become much more codified, essentially. It's going to start to develop, and it's going to start becoming incubated, because this cultural landmark needs to be digested, and the only way to digest it is that people are going to choose which side they're on. They're either going to double down into it and say, okay, we need a conscious rationalization of this incoherence, and that essentially amounts to the Führer principle. Okay, now what I was going to say, what was I just talking about before? Now it kind of parallels to this is damn, what was I just talking about? Oh, my criticism, my historic. Okay, so specifically, what I'm talking about is the Holocaust museums, and I'll just take look. I'm sorry that I haven't thought about this well enough to put this in a very very sensitive way, because I really am just getting to the principle of the matter. Obviously, I'm sensitive to the fact that the such that the extermination, the genocide of a people, is something. See, this is very, to start talking about the genocide of a people, you start you start straddling the line, and you start blurring the line between, do we care about individual life, or is there something to ethnicity? Is there something to the group collective identity which is precious, or something like that? And that starts getting you into anti-non-racialism. That starts getting you into very troubled waters. And so what I really disliked about the Holocaust museums is that the Holocaust, I believe, is a term that has been completely, it refers to the Jewish genocide. It doesn't refer to the other killing that the Nazis did. It doesn't, I don't believe that I've, when I'm talking to a a tour guide in a Holocaust museum that I went to, and I'm a very young person. I'm 9 years old or something, or I'm 10 years old, and I'm asking very basic questions, and these basic questions cannot be asked, and they're being answered in such an embarrassing kind of way. And this is what I mean by embarrassing. So I say, what is the Holocaust? Oh, the Nazis killed these people. And then they also say that, oh, they killed these other people. And I say, okay, well, how many people did they kill altogether? And then the answer is, we don't entirely know, I don't have the numbers offhand. I'll have to go and check that up. So you have a whole museum around how something that bad that happened in human history as a phenomena of sociology, as a phenomena of politics, as a phenomena of fascist, corrupt, totalitarian ideology. And you don't even have the actual description of the perpetrator. You only have a description of the victim. It's all relative to the victim, not into understanding what caused this evil. No. It's all seen through the eyes of the victim to give you this kind of emotional sympathetic response. So I do think that there was a giant opportunity to immunize the world against this kind of evil, but instead it was corrupted into a form of identity politics that, it all centers around this panic button of anti-Semitism. So that the Jewish people can feel safe, that they're not going to be exterminated, because if they're getting close to being exterminated, they can push the anti-Semitism button, and everyone has this kind of built-in idea that this is associated with badness. Now, maybe you could have done both at the same time. Maybe, it's not, because in some sense you can say, well, it's fulfilling its function now because maybe it's going to topple the left's identity politics in terms of what this black fascism is. Because essentially, but I do think that this is actually likely a precipitate of Jewish identity politics to begin with. And I am slightly sympathetic because I do actually think that what goes on in the Middle East in terms of the Palestinian politics, I don't think that the Palestinians are just victims of the aggressive Israeli state. I think that there is very clearly a religious mentality and something like anti-Semitism, which, again, like I'm questioning the whole construct of anti-Semitism, but in some sense, when people actually believe that it's part of their religion, that the Jews must be defeated as Israel and as a people, and they must be wiped off the face of the map, and that I think that to call that anti-Semitism is not unreasonable. Okay, so that I do think that might be the only place wherein anti-Semitism specifically applies. Otherwise, we should just be talking about non-racialism. But people don't necessarily want to talk about non-racialism because they're not non-racialists themselves. But instead, they want to have some kind of protection or security for their group. Or they want to set up some kind of, because, that's how they see the world. They see it from their racial consciousness. They see it from the consciousness of their collective, and that is problematic in politics and morality, because that means that you're going to have a moral relative bias. You're going to have some kind of relativism baked into your worldview, and that means that at the same time, well, look, not every country in the world is a democracy, but essentially this is what. Is one of the corrupting influences and the kind of moral grandstanding opportunities that you give to people in order to kind of disguise things, and because you can keep them opaque under this kind of clunky moral language, where you can just kind of bifurcate moral issues between non-racialist issues, other people's issues are non-racialist issues, but your issues are ethnocentrically relative to your history, your special sacred victim history. And then in the interim, we never get democratic literacy. We never get responsibility, because you can always just externalize blame onto history and onto the outgroup and onto, well, other people set you up to fail, essentially. And so you can always just double down on that narrative. And you never have to actually ever be independent or take responsibility. And you have a never-ending kind of psychological spiral. Anyway, and I do think that it's not helped that we can't see geopolitics properly because of this kind of filth, which we can only really start getting peace in the world when inside nations there is actually a strong enough principled and valued moral system and accountability within a justice system and within a political culture, that then these geopolitical issues can actually be seen for what they are without, because when you've got inside of a country, when you've got these kinds of tensions, you're never going to have the kind of moral transparency in order to solve these issues abroad, as it were, or to apply the pressure on the sides that need pressure applied to. Because you're always trying to sort of punish people for some kind of historical guilt, and so you can never forge a lasting peace in the present, because everyone is so transfixed and mesmerized by this mythical history that has to do with which is inherited by their collective identity. And then you have all of these, sort of disgusting people who say, okay, well, if you want to be a non-racialist in that way, then I know what the strategy is. The strategy is I'm going to steal everything from you, and then tomorrow we'll call tomorrow Reconciliation Day. After you go back to nothing, or it's sort of like, because you can't agree on where the reset button should be, and because everyone has got different criteria for a reset button. You can never actually get, well, this is not true. You can get reset buttons within religion, within common values and shared principles and a shared vision of justice. But obviously that is undone. That's what South Africa represented to the world until it was essentially betrayed by its own constitutional court judges and politicians who have corrupted the courts. But anyway, let me not sidetrack. But in fact, South Africa was the template, I believe, that actually showed the world a better way. But then when it was corrupted itself, it misled the world into this contradiction, because the world itself does not actually understand this fundamentally at base yet. And so this is why we're living through this history, is because people are morally wicked. And they don't have proper integrity, but it also has to do with their local political structures and their local judiciary, which is just essentially, which has conceptualized justice in a very untenable way. Justice is just what the democracy decides that it should be. They don't have proper constitutional supremacy. So, this is the general answer to all of these questions, is that you don't say, yeah, I personally, I'm a supremacist. I'm a constitutional supremacist. I believe in actually having a system of the rule of law that actually applies an even justice, not a divine justice, not a perfect justice. But when the rule of law is your king and your judge, then there is accountability for everyone, equal protection and benefit before the law. And that's not going to be an entire answer to the human condition. There are going to be other things that cannot be solved by justice, by law. But at least we should have one section of society that models to us a system of accountability that reflects accountability back at us, and that doesn't let us get away with things that we can just change the law. We can just move the goalposts and say, okay, well, we need to reinvent a new social imagination or some bullshit like that. When you've got all these moving targets and you've got people doubling down in their narratives and all these disparate narratives, you have no undergirding structure upon which you could even start to have moral transparency and consistency and a kind of, there's so many things that this undermines, but essentially, when you allow people to not use reason in a coherent way and in a consistent way, but when they can switch out their reason for rationalization, and their rationalization can just apply to an ever-evolving, adaptable narrative of some kind of bias or relativism or some kind of fashion or fad, of some kind of American democratic collective troll of the conception of justice. That's what America does. America trolls what the meaning of justice is, because it just is what the democracy says that it wants it to be. And so the American system is also based on limits, where the American system says that, okay, well, the government can do whatever it wants, therefore the government cannot control private entities. It can't tell private entities what to do. The government can only tell itself what to do. It can't force society. It can't socially engineer democracy because it must be controlled by the people at large, which Ron DeSantis has actually undermined that, because now he says that private corporations cannot censor their platforms. They have to do so according to rules which are evenly applied and that are very clearly, objectively laid down so that they can be applied in a kind of... He's trying to create essentially a kind of, in my law, the constitutional right of just administrative action. Or even, we probably didn't even need just administrative action in my constitution, although the constitution obviously should support the things that already existed in the Roman Dutch substantive law and in the common law, because we already had enough general laws of application and principles in our legal system where the law was completely independent of politics already in the South African system. You need to have law to be independent of politics. Otherwise, you can't have the rule of law. Then you just, by definition, you have the rule of man if you don't have that. You can just move the goalpost. Anyway, I've dealt with this in other recordings. I'm not going to recapitulate that whole argument, but that's an important thread of this. But yeah, I mean, you just have people that are trying to solve the human condition with one political ideology or one political worldview. And that's not how the human condition is going to be resolved, especially because just because you want to have something that's resolved for you doesn't mean it's going to be resolved for the next generation. You need to have enough latitude within your society, enough freedom and enough transparency that everyone can grow up within such a system or a societal structure. And you cannot expect that the sociological structure is going to be righteous or divine. You know, you do need something that is essentially the perfection of the separation of church and state, which America never affected, because America doesn't have a stable secular law. It is made at the moral sentiments of the tyranny of the majority. And America, the structure in America has failed multiple times. It has already proven itself to be actually untenable. The McCarthyist Red Scare, where you created, I don't know if it was a congressional or a Senate committee, the Committee of Anti-American Activities, to root out people that were subverting the democracy and subverting the Constitution and all those sorts of things. Like, that's actually untenable. Government can't be involved in social engineering the democracy. It already breaks the whole structure of the Constitution, fundamentally. So I've got a whole recording on this. I shouldn't go back to recapitulate it, but anyway, those are important. You know, this is all a symptom of the fact that you don't have a legal system in which an individual can go to court and actually procure justice on the merits of the case. Instead, they have to go to court and they have to say, I'm not here to develop the common law. I'm not here to rely on my constitutional rights. I'm here to vindicate something that the legislature has said, where it's maybe been inconsistent with itself, and hopefully it won't change the law while I'm litigating this case. You know, like, that's what you go when you go to the court. You're dealing with lines drawn in the sand. When you want the courts to help you, the courts can only help you with lines drawn in the sand. It's unprincipled. There is no dignity for the individual citizen in America. You are all just a cog in the democratic machine, and your constitutional rights are window dressing. They're pretty promises, and they will never be delivered on. They cannot, because of how the American legal system is fundamentally structured, which is that the republic exists only as a rented space from the democracy. And even if you did find a way to reasonably or consistently rely on your constitutional rights, well, the democracy could just change the Bill of Rights. There's nothing stopping it from doing so. which is also the general solution to the problem, is that you need a completely different system of law, you need a completely different system of Bill of Rights that also will have some kind of legal interface with all the states as well, which will also completely revamp the structure of the American system. But I mean, this whole, the issue between states' rights and federal rights is a misnomer, or that's a disguise of the fundamental ineptitude of the entire structure. That America is designed to be an experiment, and the cost of that experiment is never-ending corruption, because people can just always morally grandstand about things that should have already been settled by the law itself, in the law itself. So, politics is about the moral argument over the conception of justice. So you never get justice because you're always approximating it and arguing about it. And there isn't enough accountability in the structure of the justice system to show how principally and reason-based and value-based the self the self-inconsistency of the entire look. I mean, the thing is an experiment that does have one decent fruit, which is that it creates a kind of philosophical propaganda and a beacon of liberty in the world, because it shows people in some sense how not to do it, or what the it creates a beautiful history where, if you read the history, you can understand the failings of the spirit of man, you can understand the human condition when you look at American history. But it's just corruption fighting against other forms of corruption, because there wasn't really that much thought done to actually resolve these issues on a deep principled basis. It's just created the semblance of something that does actually get a lot of the common people to actually act as a kind of police force. It's very, in the same way that I've said that this anti-Semitism thing is a problem, but that it can be used to kind of bring down what's going on inside the left, because it's kind of like it's seeing itself from the other side, and then it's going to be locked into a kind of contradiction. That's how the American system kind of keeps its liberty afloat, is that it causes people to get into this kind of dogma around freedom, which is all just kind of window dressing, but they force the system to be honest, or at least they force the system to superficially play to that target, to fulfill those expectations. And that kind of operates as a kind of political watchdog to curb the plutocracy in the system, as it were. That the plutocracy has to operate within some limits, that it actually accords to some superficial stricture, to some rationalization, to some theoretically plausible rationalization of liberty, even as it's not well fine-tuned. In fact, it's stuck in its own paradox, and it can't resolve that paradox. Anyway, you can see my recordings on specifically talking about the problems of the American system to kind of to interface with that. But what else should I say? So this is the kind of corruption that America sits with. And instead of sorting out the political problems in America, people have now devolved into identity politics as an ulterior sort of way of litigating for some kind of political upheaval, which really just makes the political situation more and more confused in some sense. And in my argument, in my general reading of history, it's because non-racialism was such a potent ideology in the 90s, and it was allowing people to actually get politics correct. It was civilizing people at such a high degree. The example of South Africa and the Rainbow Nation and the model of the Rainbow Nation and all those sorts of things, I think, was creating a new political epoch. And that political epoch would have rooted out plutocratic politics. It would have gotten a political discourse that is much more honest and grapples with the issues in a much more realistic and pragmatic kind of way. But if you do that, then you start what's the word, encroaching on plutocratic vested interests and big pharma and the industrial military complex. You start cutting in on their action because and they don't like that, and so instead what we now have is a very dumbed down regression, where also at the same time, because at the same time that ideologically people have attacked liberal democracy with this kind of identity politics, democratic illiteracy that helps disguise because it helps promote virtue signaling, so you can get away with all sorts of bullshit as long as you join the right groupthink in the right witch hunt. But this has lowered the pressure on Russia to get its act together internally to Russia. Like the West dropping the ball has really emboldened both China and Russia, because for other geopolitical reasons as well. I mean, Bill Clinton was a terrible president in that he had an opportunity to make bridges with Russia, which he didn't make because he's not a statesman. I mean, if history was a bit different, if Nixon continued to be the president, who we might have a completely different geopolitical scenario. Russia could be completely different if Nixon and had continued to be the president and Bill Clinton had never. Anyway, but still, these things can all. I have some ideas as to what could happen geopolitically that could still be very positive, and I think Britain is a large part of that, because I think that hopefully, if it can weather the storm of the culture war, as it were, but I think Britain geopolitically is probably the biggest model for liberal political philosophy, and maybe creating alliances based on that. Because I do think that, for example, if you look at America as well, America is going to end up with the problem where you are going to have to do what Ron DeSantis is trying to do. Ron DeSantis says this is an unprecedented historical thing. We have to worry about centralized power. We have to worry about the power of these big tech platforms, but not even the big tech platforms. Just the big corporations are going to be a problem. Because what happens when people start getting cancelled from the economy because they criticize China on their Instagram or on their Facebook or whatever it is? Because there's nothing, technically, you can't, the government is not supposed to tell private entities how to conduct their business, So the soft power of China can only be counteracted by, let's call it, a legitimate system of law and accountability that is grounded in principles and values, so that the politicians can say, don't blame us for our courts. Our courts are independent of our politics. So China, please don't be nasty to us because we can't tell our judges what to do. The law is independent. That is actually the only way to actually counteract the corruption, that the soft corruption and soft cultural power that China is going to have all over the world. In some look and look, that's an analogy to other things as well, because that's an analogy to the identity politics people and how they're doing politics inside the country itself, because they also want to get people's they also want to cancel people based on the same mechanism. So it's the same, it's the same totalitarian groupthink essentially. that is getting away with itself because it can say morally we represent our group identity. Morally, we're looking out for our people and the particular historical pain and historical sympathy that our collective identity, lived experience has gone through. So that's their excuse, and then look at what they manifest. They manifest, I mean, and this is also why labor unions and most labor movements and political action is usually amounts into kind of totalitarian Leninist kind of fascistic vanguardism. The only socialism that I really respect are the ones that actually pay for themselves, in which it's a broad labor union that has to do with the whole industry, and the people at the top of that industry take huge pay cuts to pay for the labor, to pay for the union benefits, essentially. Like if you look at the Nordic countries and things like that, where, I mean, they pay for their socialism. The top end of their society pays for socialism, and I mean that not that 1%. I mean like the top 40% pay. The the same job in those countries is paid even twice and three times the price overseas. So, it's basically solidarity where the market does not essentially value, uh, uh, let's say, essentially people have retained their workforce instead of that workforce becoming a brain drain to go chase after a higher wage. Middle management is taking a huge pay cut, essentially, is a good general way. That's the socialism that I respect, is when sort of middle management takes a huge pay cut. But you can only do that if you have a kind of cultural homogeneity, and you have a kind of common cultural ethos and a kind of common pathos, which you're not going to have that in a multicultural state that doesn't have a common vision of justice and doesn't have non-racialism, that doesn't have a common core, which has been undermined in South Africa, uh, with the betrayal of the non-racialism because of this poisonous zeitgeist and this poisonous authoritarian fascistic South Africa is literally being devastated in the name of solidarity with the black racial consciousness. Black solidarity is what has devastated South Africa with corruption, because it disguises it is corruption. I mean, essentially, um, it is the antithesis uh, of competence and because it can pretend to be moral, and it can create this fake morality. And this is the problem also, is that to actually advance this point, people need to stop complaining that the system is weak and brittle and fragile because it's being mismanaged from the leaders. We need to start criticizing the radio talk show hosts that create these false polemics that leverage the racial consciousness narrative. These are the people that we need to apply pressure to culturally. We need to say to people, you need to pick a side because these people are evil and they're anti-constitutional propaganda artists. Like they are committing a crime against humanity, or they are, in my estimation. They're creating constitutional damages, at least in the South African sense. In other countries, you don't have this opportunity because your system doesn't actually have any fundamental integrity. Your constitutional framework in Europe, in America, and all these places, they're all shit. You have shit justice and you have shit politics. But in South Africa, we have betrayed justice and betrayed politics. Very, very different. Very, very different. So here we can actually say the people that we need to punish and try and punish and sentence for their constitutional damages. There is no excuse in South Africa for what has gone on, except for essentially overt political malfeasance and you can see this, the top politicians play this hollow lip service to non-racialism while they play the racial consciousness card constantly. Anyway, but they're not being called out on it enough, quite sadly. And also because their mouthpieces and their racialist mouthpieces aren't properly being targeted. Anyway, I could have brought the issue of Joe Rogan into this. Anyway, I'll make another recording. I don't know if I want to talk about him, because that depresses me even more. I'll just say Joe Rogan is not a brave person. He's not courageous. He's not standing up against anyone. He has been pulled into the culture war. He could have gone either way very easily, and in fact, he's not in it on either side, really. He doesn't give a fuck. He doesn't have a brave bone in his body. He makes safe arguments, and he gets himself tripped up by the facts a lot because he only creates narratives that are based on facts that he thinks are safe and that he thinks are defensible, which is why when he becomes part of the culture war, it's such a huge thing, because he's obviously not a partisan exactly in it. He's just in his own little island, his own very heavily defended island of popularity and safety. And, him acting in this way is maybe an important cultural catalyst because it's kind of like a canary in the coal mine. But, Joe Rogan does not stand on principle. He stands on facile moral arguments, which, quite frankly, he doesn't take too seriously himself. He just cares about what sounds defensible, quite frankly. And he's, I mean, you can just see how quickly he can get onto his high horse onto something. And look, this is a broader argument which is perhaps completely separable, and I don't want to go into it. But the idea that someone like him is going to be included in the intellectual dark web is why the intellectual dark web, which also includes other people who, quite frankly, don't have very serious moral positions like Sam Harris. Why that container, it doesn't have enough integrity or accountability to keep itself active, because the arguments themselves are engaged in by participants who are themselves, they don't care about coherence and self-consistency. In some sense, they just care about having a winning narrative and essentially using a kind of authority claim for the ingredients that their narrative depends on, or as, let's say, ingredients that are a negative or a falsification for other people's counter narratives. They're in it for a contestation of narrative because, in some sense, that's part of the ways that they peddle. That's how they get by in the world. That's how they go along to get along. That's their strategy. They don't really care about beliefs fundamentally and grounding those beliefs, or wondering about how to do so. It's not really, it's about how much you can access in the participatory domain. I mean, and to be quite, sorry, this is a completely separable issue, so I don't almost like including it here because it just kind of tags on, but as an extra thing, which is, but I mean, I was listening to Joe Rogan talk to Jordan Peterson, And I do have other things to say about that, but and just in general, I mean, I don't. This is more criticism of Jordan Peterson. You know, look at who you are breaking bread with, Jordan Peterson. Look at who you are uh, showering with praise. That he deserves all of his success and all those sorts of things. I mean, I'll just say, like, I don't, within that context, and this is going to seem perhaps quite crude and mean and strange, but in my view, Joe Rogan is really no different from a Levian Satanist. It's just that he believes in more honey than vinegar. He believes in, in looking, being nice to people. He's made it a practice that he knows how to be nice to people. But look how he reasons his worldview. Look at how he grounds his reality and the truth in his life, if it can even be said, to contend such a concept or contend against such a concept. I mean, look, and in some sense, I do think that someone like Joe Rogan would be immensely helped if he lived in a society that actually had a proper justice system and a proper conception of justice. Because I do think that partially people are corrupted by the water that they are drunk on, that they grow up with. And I do think that Joe Rogan has learned the American culture. He knows it he knows it very well, and he knows how to survive. And he knows how to, he's created a a general solution to all of the conditions that he has that have imprinted him in his development and in the construction of his worldview. But there is no independent stability there. It's a hook. And it's a hook trying to hook onto something positive, going along to get along, essentially. And I mean, you can see this in the decisions that he makes. I've not seen him made a single brave decision, ever. I mean, why would he? Then he would probably think himself stupid if he did that. Yeah, this is someone who is only driven to make, let's say, strident action when he is convinced by people who he believes will be accountable to him if the fruit of the activity does not bear the expectation that was promised to him. Although, I mean, I have been thinking about Joe Rogan a bit more, and I think that, this can be explored. You can just see how literal he gets. He gets, when he gets onto a literal bone of contention with someone, and he won't drop it. He won't contend seriously with the figurative truth, as it were. He won't even get onto the wavelength that someone might be trying to talk about a figurative truth. He doesn't test these things. He's completely spiritually blind in some sense. He just cares about, well, how convincing can you be to the everyman? How convincing can you be to the world, to the democracy? He's become completely bred and conditioned by this democratic American uh, uh, homogenization of his soul. I still think his criteria is just it's too warped towards success, external success, and he hasn't grounded the concept of an internally grounded, truth and belief in God, essentially. He doesn't believe that there is an internal grounding. He's looking for, he's just got an internal hook to hook onto something external. Anyway, that's why Joe Rogan is spiritually dead. And to heap so much praise onto someone who I consider to be spiritually dead, I mean, that's not to say that he can't be reborn or resurrected, but, because, I mean, these things often, they have to do with failed excursions on the in the sand pit when you're 3 years old, when you define success or you define the purpose of your life in some contrived sense that then limits the ambit of your apperception, as it were, that because you don't want to fall on the, what's the word, you don't want to fall on the wrong side of the false authority, so instead you inculcate the false authority into your own rationalization of purpose. So, when you've been burnt by something, then you learn how to manage and cope with it, but then you do so in such a way that you become internally dependent on it. I mean, this is how people love the darkness, is that they are exposed to it and then they attach themselves to it for safety, and then they become this increpid what's the word? Abomination. And that's what it is to me, that on a spiritual sense, it's a spiritual abomination. And it is a beast because it cannot even see its own conditioning. But it represents that conditioning against others. Anyway, I mean, all you really have to do is chop it down inside yourself with a double-edged sword, which is actually quite helpful because the double edge means that on the edge that cuts you, it cuts you to life and to freedom. But anyway, okay, let me continue on from my last recording. Yeah, this is probably getting embarrassing. Near the end there, where I'm talking about these things about socialism and the left, and I haven't even placed that in a context as to why it could be relevant. I mean, I guess it's thematically relevant, although I haven't drawn the dots, so perhaps it sounds a bit confused. But I've been talking to a group of leftists, I guess, although I think it's actually incorrect to call them leftists. Although these are people who definitely identify as being of the left, but what that means in practice is that I want to make some social commentary, and I want to criticize the so-called left. Look, the left, in a kind of lowest common denominator, in the sense that you include utopian socialists or utopian communists with people who are of at least a more intellectual persuasion of classical Marxism, which doesn't really exist in the left at all. It's all been completely overrun by Leninists who call themselves orthodox Marxists. So they're just vanguardists. They believe in an elite-led revolution and essentially lots and lots of propaganda and lots of slave morality in some sense to keep the plebs in line so that they can be part of the grand sort of human insect collective machine, which is just designed in some collective sense to fix boogeymen, and so it only runs by having ideological scapegoats. In the same way that the Soviet Union was run, that essentially class consciousness was just essentially was very similar to the same kind of blood and soil mythology that the fascists, it was the same. It just had obviously the Marxist totalitarian Leninist synthesis was had humanitarian pretensions because it didn't have to be ethnocentric or relative to a kind of ethnic identity. It just had to, in some sense, it had a lowest common denominator, which is just that we should all define evil as being capitalist extraction, and so we must all be joined in our class consciousness into our slave morality. And when you create that kind of false flag reduction of the human condition into that superficial problem, then you obviously create a lot of false consciousness and you create a lot of opportunity for corruption, which is what the Soviet Union suffered from, but also in some sense by design. Um, a coordinator class, the nomenclatura that essentially ran everything, just as any other plutocracy would in any other society, but with every excuse for the system to essentially have no real check on their power, except that you continue to scapegoat the ideological enemy that keeps everyone together. So that becomes the only check on power, is that superficial narrative that the whole ideology is premised on or predicated on. And if that's how leftism defines itself, which is actually how it basically, that's how people of the left conceive of themselves, is let's create a sacred victimhood and a collective systemic oppression that we can all be opposed to, and then we can all join into our Leninist solution to the problem, essentially. That's what leftism passes for now, essentially, or at least radical leftism, so called. Now, this is not even to critique what is actually intellectually what their problem is. I mean, that is a political problem. That is a problem, a psychological problem. They're sorry, like their program leads to bad things because it's just so stupid, essentially, because it's so superficial, because it's so stuck into its own tunnel vision, and then it just doubles down on promulgating that tunnel vision, and then because essentially it's all set up by precaution, you can use those precautionary ideological virtue signaling in order to create a purity test that keeps everyone chained to the same narrative. So it becomes addicted to its own sort of manipulative narrative means of control. Okay, so all of that aside, because so it's sort of, that's a secondary problem that it is prone to itself. But let's say, what is the first problem, which you have to take a step back to actually see what the first problem is. The first problem is that they tried to think that there is one solution to the human condition, and that solution is essentially a kind of political solution, or it's a sociological solution, that you need a one-size-fits-all church state. You need a state power and a state authority which becomes like what church is supposed to do to people. Like church is supposed to evangelize, proselytize, and reflect morality and be the foundation or the pillar of culture. So they want a state that is part of a cultural core, and that that is a one-stop shop. Now the problem with this is that human beings can be indoctrinated into structures and into systems, sure, but they also have to grow and develop, and they also have to learn things for themselves. And if you have a system that is so dishonest and brittle and corrupt in so many different ways that you have to believe in orthodoxy, then you don't give people the latitude to actually understand something. Now, I'm all for resolving the liberal intolerance paradox, and actually saying, no, there are limits on free speech. You don't get to question the removal of other people's constitutional rights, and because that's essentially that's effectively on par with propaganda for war. You don't get to philosophize and make political arguments as to how we could more efficiently do something if we just could ignore people's constitutional rights in order to massage things, because that's essentially, well, that's giving up the rule of law, and it's essentially saying that, I mean, it falls foul of the Kantian categorical imperative that you're using people as a means to an end, not an ends in themselves, and the idea that you can kind of promulgate a kind of an imagination or a hypothetical solution to the human condition, where you give yourself that power, you are essentially, it's funny because Kant himself, I think, arguably fell into his own paradox, into thinking that you can create institutions that can essentially be surrogate categorical imperative purveyors. But whenever you try to institutionalize the categorical imperative and to systematize it, you end up actually directly invalidating itself, because then you're saying that this institution or this organization is, loyalty to this institution is the same as loyalty to the categorical imperative, and then you have an unprincipled, and also you divorce actual consciousness, actual authentic contemplation and agency into an ideological narrative which everyone has to parrot the orthodoxy thereof. So you end up with a kind of dishonesty, a brittle dishonesty that everyone accepts is functional to some greater good, even though that whole formula is antithetical to itself. Now, this is what leftism in general, this is what it amounts to. And and they take the bait of the global climate crisis and all that shit to try to spin up the same systemic oppression blaring siren call for conformity and for getting in line and being provisioned for according to your centralized top-down categorization of how the systemic problem needs to be solved. And so because they can't get out of this centralization modality of their contemplative hypothetical sort of idea, well, let's just create a religion essentially of how politics should be administered, and then we'll enforce it, which is just, the whole project is completely untenable because it completely penetrates and pierces the individual integrity, and they can't think that, okay, well, let's try solve the political problem, and then we'll solve the economic problem, and we'll solve the environmental problem. And by the way, I don't actually believe in carbon dioxide caused global warming. The Earth is warming. It's because we're exiting the little ice age, and this was always going to happen. Climate has always changed on this planet. I mean, there used to be a huge fucking forest in Europe, and there used to be Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. Things change. Like get over it. Carbon dioxide in the air is actually probably a good thing. But anyway, I mean, yes, the Earth is going to. The thing we should really have to worry about is pollution and the damage to the oceans and ecological damage, which has nothing to do with global warming. That has to do with other things. And if we were actually serious about replacing plastic with something that wasn't, because I mean, how we depend on plastic simply because it's cheaper, and all these externalized costs, that is something that could actually be tackled not by recycling. I mean, the whole recycling thing is such a scam. It's actually, whenever I see people going, like, just replace plastic with fungus or something, with mycelium, or where they grow it into molds, or only create plastic things that are literally so expensive that that it's worth recycling them. The idea that you should not be able to produce a consumable plastic item unless it's actually, without incentive and without regulation, it would be advantageous for someone to want to recycle it. You should make it essentially a fundamental economic incentive. You shouldn't try to legislate. I mean, how it's being managed. You know, recycling is not something that you solve on an individual level. That's exactly this kind of bullshit purity test, virtue signaling hysteria. The idea that people should be guilty for the systemic oppression that their existence causes to the world. I mean, this is like a psychological psyop. It's really is pathetic watching people buy into this kind of tripe, but obviously it helps the general fascistic zeitgeist and the general mood of identity politics, and because it's the same way of framing your worldview. It's I mean, Hitler famously was a vegetarian. you know uh, I mean, if you ever spoken to a vegan, you know what it's like to be harassed by a Nazi. It's the same so-called leftoid idea that you need to be infantilized by some political project which will essentially be your state and guarantee your. The problem is that human nature itself and the human condition cannot be gamed like this, because when you create this false flag ideological scapegoat and this common enemy for society to collectively fight against. I mean, this is why I'm afraid that all these so-called left people will eventually, they average out into fascism essentially, because proper leftism, if it was actually grounded, would essentially take Marx seriously, take his core hypothesis seriously, realize that there's a lot of revision that has to be done because, look, I mean, I still think that classical Marxism is still basically intact. The Marxist hypothesis is very, very simple. Marxist hypothesis is just capitalism is not the end, and that's a problem. That's a real big fucking problem. It's a problem for everyone because capitalism is amazing. That's the Marxist hypothesis. Capitalism is so fucking amazing, and it's not forever. So what now? That's the Marxist hypothesis. That's all it is. The idea that Leninism is the solution to that, I mean, is horrendously stupid. And trying to replay that game is so fucking retarded. It's not. I mean, it's utopian, but it's not even utopian. It's misanthropic. It's evil. It is actually. It's palpably psychologically, developmentally self. It's self discrediting. It's basically saying, I couldn't live without religion, so I had to turn statism or centralized political control and authority into my vision of religion, essentially. And I can't imagine a dynamic world that has independence in it and independent agents and free will. So, we need a one-size-fits-all solution. And they just don't have the compunction or the interest to say, okay, well, let's actually just responsibly, with integrity and morality and some sense, let's just solve problems, and then we'll solve them one by one, and we won't be ham-fisted and be far-reaching and try to do too much with too many things. Because maybe, if we need a moral revolution, we shouldn't do it through the fucking state. We should actually have a separation of church and state. But that's essentially what is wrong with leftism, is that they've generally conflated church and state, and they've tried to turn the human condition into a kind of economic political problem to be solved. And that reduction is so stupid, and so it has too few dimensions in it, and so there's this general tendency to just conflate things. And then also they cotton on to interesting things in the world. You know, they have so many fucking intellectual, fashionable ideas to, to see if they'll fulfill the general systemic top-down control manipulation of the narrative. And, you know, they just don't have it in their toolkit because, you know, they've forgotten they've forgotten how vicious Marx was to utopian communists. They've forgotten that, you know. But I mean, look, I mean, Marx is not, he doesn't have clean hands because he was co opted by people into creating revolutionary propaganda. And although he did place many caveats in his predictions and in his speculations, um, I mean, he made false assumptions, which are not his fault for making. I mean, they were reasonable assumptions at the time, but now we know that they're false. I mean, if you understand what happened in Marx's lifetime, capitalism only functioned around a strong state. The state was the only thing big enough that had a big enough bureaucracy, and during Marx's lifetime, the bureaucracy of the state, you know, exponentially grew. And it was the sophistication of the state and the centralized organizing structure that the state provided that was the scaffolding for the growth of capitalism. And so generally, I believe that this corrupted his analysis into is assuming that, you know, that you needed a dictatorship of the proletarian and that you needed to have seizing the state instead of seizing the means of production, because the state and the means of production, the state was almost like a preeminent undergirding scaffolding that everything was plugged into, and that, you know, and you needed the central, because that's how everything was organized essentially, to some degree or another, or that's how coordination at least happened via the medium that the state provided, or something like that. Now, this is completely, I mean, you don't need any of this shit now. If you wanted to have a communist revolution, get on with it. You don't need to get your hands dirty in politics. In an open democratic society, you can literally just, if you also have a sophisticated enough legal system, you can free yourself from the system. You can, you know, you can get land patents, get iodial title, get iodial deeds and property rights. You know, unbond your land from the state so that you're not, you know, liable for, you know, obviously, you know, you can't just unbond your property from the fire department if you don't have your own fire department, you know. So be responsible, and if the legal system is not sophisticated enough to allow you to be independent of the system, because, by the way, you must always be prone to the judiciary. Just because you want to have your own separate economic relations with your fellow man, with your freedom of contract to do so, and your freedom of association to do so, just get fucking on with it. You know, you are going to have to be in league with the justice system. You know, you can't break the law in your local place or whatever. You must still subject yourself to the general political. This is why I think that the political solution is a separate. It is an important piece of a puzzle, but it's not. It's something that, you know, we need to get politics transparent and functional, but don't try to turn politics into the revolution. If you try to do that, you're trying to create state capitalism or some Leninist socialist gulag, you know. Like, why do you want to take over the state if you supposedly care about human liberation and revolution? Why do you want to go after the state? You know, the only excuse you can make for that is that you're paranoid that the state is going to come in and destroy if you try to build the commune, if you try to build your independent economic solution to the problem. And then you want to be like Lenin, and you want to say, oh, but we're paranoid that we're going to be infiltrated by state actors and they're going to undermine us from within. No, how about you use your technology and you use your psychology and you use your better cultural system to weed out the infiltrators. And maybe there aren't infiltrators. Maybe the infiltrators that you will label as infiltrators are just the fact that you don't know how to get along with your fellow man, or you don't know how to diagnose your fellow man when your fellow man is actually dysfunctional, is actually pathological, And so it's not easy to make a society filled with imperfect people when you don't have an actual solution to the human condition. So you're just going to generalize that into a political polemic and be paranoid about things and create a false flag ideological enemy because you can't actually deal with actually solving the real problem on the ground. So you make up a false reduction, you falsely conflate what the real problem is, and then you create a whole false consciousness around that. That's what leftism essentially is. So there is no excuse, just get on with it. The idea, what are you waiting for? You're waiting for somebody else to do it for you. So that means that you don't know how to do it. So you want to complain about a system that you deserve perfect, you deserve better, but you don't know how to do it yourself, but you demand it from the ether. It is the leftoid worldview in that sense, if that can be described as leftism, is a psychological, developmental, juvenile, it's I want to create a boys' club, or I mean, a treehouse club where me and my friends can go and we can imagine how we would do it better and we would do the world better, but we don't have the power, so we should be allowed to steal the power and we should be able to disrupt and we should be able to do whatever we want because our demands aren't being met. And we don't know how to actually convince people onto our side except by creating these very unreasonable arguments, and so they just keep on turning up the temperature with their emotion because they're quite unreasonable. And yes, some of what they say holds water because they're living in an imperfect system, but they're not interested in trying to make the system good. They're not interested in trying to fix the system. They just want their solution. So they're not honest actors. They're not genuine people, as it were, because they've got their own partisan expediency. And that expediency is the expediency of all demagoguery that leads you towards fascism, essentially, because it's built into the structure of the dishonesty. Because they're not being responsible enough, essentially, and essentially, if you try to be responsible, the zeitgeist of the left and the mood of the left is just so intellectually dishonest. It's so bound up in doubling down in its own false narrative and its own promulgation of this false narrative that it's literally addicted to. It's literally addicted to it. It is anathema to reality. They are so addicted to their religion of their political chauvinism and their political platform, essentially. Because it's easier to cry about something that you can concoct a narrative about than to be responsible about something that actually generalizes the blame and makes it a lot harder problem to solve, because the problem is actually that we don't know what the fuck we're doing. We don't know how to deal with the human condition yet. We don't understand enough about psychology. We don't understand about how to adjudicate problems between people. But somehow we want to take the reins of power and displace the whole system, and we don't even know what the fucking plan is yet. We'll make it up as we go along, and what'll fill in the gaps is that we'll demonize and scapegoat the problems onto some, onto some identitarian scapegoat. Essentially, it's going to be fascism. That's what leftism is heading towards. Is exactly what. There was a group of Italian Marxists, and they ended up becoming fascists because they said it's all the same anyway. This is what it's going to average out to, and that is a potential answer to the Marxist hypothesis, and it's an answer that's is going to be it's going to be terrible for humanity to become essentially an insect race that is going to be governed from a spiritually dead ideological narrative that will actually force stupid, it ends up creating towers of Babel, because you end up having to believe in things that no one believes in. It becomes like the Soviet Union. Everyone pays lip service, and that's a kind of self-righteousness, and a kind of sanctimonious self-righteousness, which doesn't it becomes, it becomes the social virtue signal. It becomes the social handshake and the social manifestation of virtue, and so you think that you've found a way to manifest religion or manifest morality or manifest integrity because you've turned it into a social token. You've turned it into a motif of how good you are in the system of the social hierarchy and the ideological control. And it's a kind of, you know, and this is what these juvenile so-called intellectuals gravitate to, is that's the currency that they deal in. That is the cultural currency, because it's comfortable for them, because they don't have to challenge themselves, because then they can deal with their own filthy soul on the level of society. They can translate it into a projection onto societal structures, and they think that essentially that the society collectively can crucify itself. They believe in vicarious redemption. They believe in a collective redemption, which is the same thing that the fascists believe, essentially, it is fascism. I would argue that this is, the quality of intellectualism on the left. I mean, I only know Slavoj Žižek is, I think, the only. And sadly, he's not even 100% honest, because he can't be. He would be more honest if he could, actually. Slavoj Žižek is tiptoeing on a tightrope because he doesn't want to get completely spat out. Even Noam Chomsky completely crumbled into nonsense and moral incoherence. Just shows you, you can have such a storied reputation and history, and you throw it all away, just to try to sort of bring out some landing lights to land the plane closer to sanity. You throw your entire reputation away just that you can try to civilize, or while at the same time giving fascists who call themselves leftoids, you lend them your credibility by entertaining them instead of rebuking them. So I think leftism has shown its hand as being essentially a meeting place of juvenile reprobates, of miscreants who don't want to grow up, or at least face the challenges of psychological development as individuals. Instead, they need a state church. They need a political solution to their psychological problem, and how they project their psychology onto politics. This is what identity politics has done in spades. It's created that, it's all social. They're trying to manage social psychology, and it becomes more and more overtly fascistic and ludicrous and incoherent, because when you translate politics into managing social psychology, you bastardize politics. I mean, yes, there were already political problems which could be solved, but those aren't even on the fucking radar on the left. They're just trying to surf the tide and sail the waves and see when it's their chance to get another collective narrative of some systemic oppression back to be the central organizing principle. This is the same state that the left was in Weimar Germany, by the way. That there were, eventually the communists did violently oppose the fascists, but the fascists were very happy with the communists, because they're just another leg they help destabilize the liberal order. They help prepare the culture for the fascistic worldview, because the leftist worldview, generally speaking, formulaically is answered by the fascistic worldview. So they are bedfellows, even if they aren't overtly correspondent, overt collaborators. They are de facto collaborators. But you can see in America, though, that the confusion of postmodernism has essentially meant that these leftists supposedly, they don't really oppose identity politics. They are always kind of ambiguous about it. So in my view, the reason why they have to lend credence to it is because essentially they are proto-fascist themselves. They have been converted into useful idiots, as Hitler would call them. Uh, they are the lipstick on the pig of the identity politics totalitarian program. Um, and they're happy to be the lipstick as long as they get to kiss someone, as long as someone will call them pretty, and someone will stroke their ego and will include them, and will listen to them, and then they can perhaps see themselves in the controlling structure, or see their intellectualism in power, or some representation of it. But this is so you could imagine that I mean, by the way, Hitler was very envious of the Soviet Union. He had plans to socialize more of the economy after the war, because all of the, he always tried to find out how the Soviet Union was organizing itself. Um, and he admired it greatly, that kind of central control. Although I do think that actually the fascistic strategy of just demanding the outcome and then controlling culture so as to compel compliance, is a much safer position, because then if things fail, you can always just scapegoat the blame. You can just say, oh, your mentality was infiltrated by the Jewish conspiracy, or you can always just you never take responsibility for anything that happens, because you just set the targets, and the people who fail the targets are the traitors to the system and to the culture and to the ethos. Um, so it's interesting because I mean, in the Soviet Union, there is a much quicker recognition, I think, that the system. This is an irrelevant point, but I mean, the hypocrisy, the fundamental hypocrisy in the entire system is much more generally understood, much more quickly. But then there's a secondary form of endorsement that takes place, that you still love the system even for its overt impractical failure, that because you burden that, and because you can countenance that, then your devotion is actually pure, that because you're part of the system that is, going to be the liberation of humanity, so it's the means are justified by the ends. um, and then that is also, I think, also a kind of terror management theory that perhaps makes you think that your ego does have this kind of collective resurrection, or fundamental eternal redemption. Um, so I do think that it functions as a religion, essentially. Um, that essentially the ethic is seen as being eternal, uh, and the final destination anyway. And so you might as well just get there sooner. But I was going to say something else about fascism and the current identity politics stuff. Anyway, yes, I don't think the left can really get its act together. I don't think it'll be able to coalesce itself, because it only, if it ever had a seed of genuine promise inside of it. It was what I consider classical Marxism, which has to be revised to some degree in order to keep it relevant or pertinent. And so, you have to be a left Marxist. You have to, and what I mean by that is you have to be a libertarian Marxist. But there's no libertarian thread within anyone who calls themselves Marxist. They usually are orthodox, and they've even been able to say that they are orthodox. And what they mean by that is they mean that they're Leninist. So somehow orthodox Marxism means the person who most radically altered Marxist analysis the most into a preemptive revolution, into a holding action, into the vanguardism of perpetual revolution as well, into all this bullshit, all this psychological paradox, all based on paranoia, all based on, well, if we wait for history to happen like Marx wants us to, then we'll never get the chance because they'll have too much technology. The proletarian will be outgunned by the nano, by the nano. I mean, I'm putting words in his mouth, but not exactly. But I'm just updating. I mean, this is what Lenin said. Lenin said that technology will get so advanced that basically you can't guarantee that you'll have a successful revolution because they'll have weaponry that will be able to the upper class will have will have will basically will go back to Roman aristocracy and plutocracy, or it'll become essentially. Lenin said, "No, we're going to become an overt plutocracy." So already he was misanthropic. Already he had essentially because he could imagine a worst case scenario. Then he could say, well, then there's no hope in the human condition. We must seize power while we still have the chance, because we won't have a chance in the future. When capitalism collapses, he said, when capitalism collapses, they'll have so many machines fighting on their side that we'll never be able to win. Therefore, we must seize power now. That's the Leninist argument. And anyway, sorry, I'm talking about. I guess this doesn't really relate to anything to do with Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan, or Whoopi Goldberg. It doesn't have anything to do with any of those things. But the point is that what labor movements and what so-called socialistic, sort of fomenting disquiet, what that usually amounts to is it's very regressive, generally speaking, when labor is asserting itself. The much better way, the much more organic way, is that you actually have to have a labor shortage. If you have a labor shortage, then the price of labor will go up when people are fighting over labor. So the only way to have a labor shortage is to essentially restrict unskilled unskilled migration, or the migration of unskilled workers. You need to seal off economies so that you can actually stabilize the cost of labor, and that it can actually people can compete for it. If people don't compete for something, it's not going to be valued if you have an oversupply of it. So the idea is that in a mixed system in which you have no check on immigration or the migration of unskilled workers, but then you have some industries which are unionized, then you've literally just created a labor cartel, uh, which will be very good for those workers, um, but the cost of that labor is being privileged at the cost of all other labor. And uh, I should probably have better economic vocabulary, but essentially, this is, it's sort of, it's literally is not in my backyard type of solving the problem. It's like, it's very selfish. Like, if you want to actually support labor, then you should actually have, um, within a capitalistic framework, you should do that. You shouldn't try to create this mixed oxymoronical system in which, oh, this feels good to advance the cause, and to cause, and to apply pressure to force people to capitulate to your demands, when those demands don't make sense within a market system. And in fact, when you make them validate demands that don't make sense within a market system, you're working at odds against the entire system. So, I mean, if you actually want to increase utility, if you want to make people's lives better, then you should actually fix the price of labor. If that is what you're interested in doing, then fix the price of labor. But no, you're trying to sort of have it both ways. You don't want to fix the price of labor. You just want to be disruptive to the system entirely. You want weird signals to be thrown out, where it's like suddenly you cross the state line and now the minimum wage is like triple the minimum wage on the other, whereas it's much better just to have no minimum wages, because then you'll also get more employment, and also people will find a price based on their productivity, uh, because there's no compulsion in the system. When you have compulsion and mixed up signaling, the market doesn't function. You've disrupted the market to such an extent, and then you've also made it not possible to actually assist the price of labor in the entire market. Instead of, because that is how you would fix these things. This is how you would bolster these things. Is you would have to look at structural, systemic things, and policy and regulate those things. You know, like the lack of vocational induction into fields where you need more skills of a particular kind, and uh, yeah, and all these shortages that take place because of the bad signaling and the general disruption that is caused by trying to socialize something that is fundamentally driven by a market, and so you've just ended up creating fake signals. But I mean, anyway, there are other huge problems in the American economy, um, which have to do with, I believe, undermining the real economy in America, which has to do with a lot of financial things. But anyway, I'm not going to add that to this recording. But and all of these things that are anticipated before they happen, like people complaining that, oh, well, driverless cars and automation mean that all these things are going to, be bad, or whatever. I don't actually take that. I mean, I'll wait for it to happen. I don't think, I don't think that's likely to happen. Also because when automation occurs, look, we will have to move into a different model. Uh, the, the This is quite complicated, but I think that one of the general solutions into the future is to create something like cooperatives that are autarkical and that trade with each other and that are essentially an alternative to the market, because this would also, I think, stabilize wages in the market. If you had an alternative to living in capitalism, then you would have to incentivize people to participate in capitalism. And I mean, there are lots of models also that you could do around this, because there is actually a socialistic model that I think is morally self-consistent. I still wouldn't want to live in it, and I still think it's a problem. But I mean, I think also it's a good argument that shows socialists just how stupid their whole worldview is and how juvenile their whole worldview is. Because, if you did this kind of thing, I think it shows you the reductio ad absurdum. It's not really a reductio ad absurdum, but it's a tangible system that you could imagine implementing, and then you could just actually see how quickly the socialist drive runs out when it doesn't get to have its sadistic edge, when it doesn't get to sort of, when it actually has to pay for its own socialized goods up front, you know, and everyone becomes dependent on the state, or at least the people, or not everyone, but most people will become dependent on the state in that kind of model. Then you get let's say, the motivation problem, and that becomes completely synced with politics. And so then you finally don't have this democratic illiteracy spiraling out of control, because it's not just people saying, oh, the rich need to pay their fair share, we need to vote and take more money from the rich. It's the reverse. When you have structures where you pay a flat quantum tax, so that means that all the poor people will have all their income taxed immediately, and then they just have to vote for making sure that what tax is collected is given to people that are effective at producing services and amenities. And therefore the political vote becomes much more about, okay, well, we've actually appointed the wrong person, or we've given the wrong contract, and it's inefficient, because government inefficiency can just completely get away with itself, because they can just continue to blame the rich for everything, that the rich aren't paying their fair share. And so, there's no incentive for government to be efficient. Because it's all just covered by this moral scapegoating, essentially. So anyway, so if you remove the moral scapegoating, then you can actually get a responsible kind of socialism, but then you deal with the motivation problem, essentially. But something like that could also be a model for a private cooperative or a private organization, although I think that private organizations might take on very different systems, internal systems and accounting systems that preserve liberal independence and agency, and being able to choose what you consume and what you invest in and what you can also inherit and all those sorts of things. I do think that private property essentially is going to have to be maintained for human psychology in order for development to occur. Because if you can just systematize accountability and responsibility in every generation, you are going to essentially make the state into an orphanage. The state is basically going to be running an orphanage, and everyone is going to be effectively treated as an orphan, even if they have a family. So you're going to perversely incentivize family structures. It's going to be very misanthropic. It's going to be very dysgenic as well. I don't believe in eugenics, but I do believe that you need to de-incentivize dysgenic, perverse incentives and parasitic exploitation, which is what happens in a lot of welfare-esque type structures. If you're going to give people access to resources, you have to impose moral standards. And obviously the state is not really allowed to impose moral standards on individuals, because then it's like you need a separation of church and state. This is why charity has traditionally come from the private sector. because at least the private sector can say, no, we're going to pick and choose who we help because you are actually a free rider, or you are actually a bad actor, and you need to get over the human condition before you get unfettered assistance and support to do more of your wickedness, or more of your self-deception. Or, we're not going to subsidize your self-deluded, never-ending, self-fueling sympathy case. Like, just because you can generate sympathy about yourself and say, well, I was made this way, and you have so you've given up your agency, you've turned yourself into an animal, and now the system must continually, uh, 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 I mean, this is a moral paradox. We have to stop getting ourselves knotted into moral paradoxes. Um, but these are things that most leftist thinkers can't get into, because they're trying to find a one-size-fits-all solution. They want the state to be a church, essentially. They want a church state. And that fundamental reduction or conflation just completely poisons their whole worldview, because then they can't look at people dynamically. They can only look at people towards making that a reduction that would be convenient. They're forced into conflating issues and making reductions that are convenient to what they really anticipate is the solution to the problem. Anyway, sorry. So I was just saying that, so you can have these private organizations that can be structured like socialism, and then they can, maybe you could do this, and you could have buy-in systems. I mean, I don't see, if I can have a gym membership that allows me effectively to share gym equipment with other people, why can't I, in the same way, have a share ownership in something that provides me with an amenity that, and essentially, this system, all it does is it creates enough surplus that it can sustain itself. Um, I mean, all capitalism. The thing that made capitalism great is two things. It's the concentration of capital investment, because concentrating capital investment increases productivity, and increases in productivity mean an increase in wealth. Because then the more you concentrate capital investment, the less labor input you need for the same output. So all you need is something that can do capital investment. If you can do capital investment, you can have the same potential of wealth production that capitalism has. The other thing that you need is decentralization, which is a hedge against what's a hedge against a lot of psychological things as well as economic things. But when you decentralize things, you get much more responsive, because it's, by definition, it's decentralized. You're not going to have all your eggs in one basket, but you're also you're never going to fall into paradoxes which are created by creating ideal models of systems. But the other thing as well is, the problem is that you do have to give people scope to hang themselves, if I can put it like that. You have to give people the ability to create troubles and tragedies in their own life, because if you don't do that, then they're not free, and people will do that because there is a self-destructive thing which people have to develop out of, and that's not going to be cured overnight. And it's not ever going to be cured perennially as well. It's going to be rediscovered. The solution to that issue is going to be rediscovered in every generation. And you have to have the latitude for people to operate in a system, which is why I think, it's important to have a system that is running on the right principles and values, but those values and principles are not going to anticipate and solve all problems. They are going to, because many principles and values can only operate from an individual. They can't operate from a structure or from a judge. A judge can't solve the human condition. A judge can solve the problems that a judge can solve. And so we must stop conflating justice and political democratic power. These things must be seen as independent and separate and operating separately from one another, but they must also have their particular ambit and their particular space so that the individual can also operate. And there's no sensitivity to these sorts of things, and which is why these issues of sexual identity have been weaponized so greatly as part of the leftoid hysterical systemic oppression narrative grifting, create enough confusion and enough panic and hysteria that then their formulas seem palpable. But yeah, if there is a good alternative to the market that is like a private club which you can join, and maybe you can, you have to really believe in the same culture because they won't just accept you. You have to have the same moral, roughly speaking. You have to assimilate into it because it's perhaps not just, and maybe there are a whole lot of different ones. So you can choose which one that you want to be a part of, or you can be a part of multiple of them if you can hold multiple membership cards, and as long as you can keep track of all their different accounting systems or whatever. But I mean, the biggest problem is that when you liberate people from the market at least had accountability built into the system. That's why the market is so monstrous and dehumanizing, because it says that essentially the market can say things like this. It's like your parents weren't responsible and they didn't do proper accounting, and you weren't responsible and you didn't do proper accounting, and now someone has to pay the piper. Whereas if you liberate people from the market, then you actually have to say, well, you can't just have 1,000 children and expect society to look after your children and to feed your children and to clothe your children. You can only have so many children. You can't. So doing these sorts of things is if you want to liberate people from the market, you need other forms of accountability, and human beings are not great about accountability. I mean, that's why we're in the mess that we're currently in, is because they won't even solve glaring problems to be solved. Transparency in politics, they don't care because they've got bigger fish to fry. They've got a bigger demagogic polemic to make. Or, I mean, I'm talking about the left specifically. I mean, the right is actually dealing with these matters properly, I would say, or largely speaking, they're in the right ballpark. The left is just completely irrelevant, but that's because uh, they are somewhat in league with the problem. They are part of this kind of juvenile thing. Anyway, this is quite a long recording. I'm going to have to. This is an addendum that I'm adding on to refine some ideas that I started talking about, but I never completed them. So, uh, the thing about how labor movements in the West, or usually in America, are really quite regressive is because, unless you actually do have a holistic approach, like the original Bernie Sanders, who has even sold out his own general prescription on these issues, Bernie Sanders would say, having open borders is a Koch brothers conspiracy to lower and undermine wages for the working class in America. That's what original Bernie Sanders is. Now Bernie Sanders is for open borders, because that's what the left amounts to in terms of its integrity. It doesn't. It's not It's not serious about these things. It's not serious about these issues. It likes creating the chaos and the contradiction, because then it can try to capitalize on being hysterical about the whole thing, because it can just kind of scapegoat the further the further destabilization. Then supposedly they get to inherit the benefit of that by directing that hysteria against their ideological enemies. Even never mind the lack of honesty in all of this. But this is how corruption takes hold. This is how the Leninistic vanguardism gets it's creates a propaganda false consciousness to get its way, and then to bully people using groupthink. And so anyone who just speaks up against the groupthink then just gets demolished, gets stampeded over. That's how they, and then they call it revolutionary to make up for this disgusting so-called revolutionary action. But so if you were serious about these issues, you would want to help general wages in America. You wouldn't want to go for this very selfish contradiction where if you unionize a whole industry and then you get big government to collude with you in order to create a little labor cartel in a particular industry, then because that industry, usually these industries, if you do this, they're not competitive. They'll get undercut from foreign suppliers or whatever. So it encourages protectionism on the national level, which is actually very bad for foreign countries that is like China. I do actually think that there is logic into making China a middle income country, because the hope is that if you made China a middle income country, then the middle class that rise in China would then push for democracy and would liberalize, and we would also have a much more stable geopolitical situation, which was where China was going until the left fucked up the West, essentially, and identity politics completely decimated liberal democracy, open liberal democracy, by all this multicultural relativism and nihilism and racial consciousness. So now the whole thing is a mess. In the same way that actually trying to promote feminism in the third world is a complete mess with all this identity politics filth, all this totalitarian false consciousness. But anyway, so just focusing in on this economic issue, if you have a protected part of the labor market in a country, but other industries aren't protected, and you force everyone to use that industry because you've got national trade barriers and you've got protectionism and all these sorts of things, what do you end up doing? You end up creating fascism. That's exactly what you end up creating. National socialism. That's the only. In fact, it is on a micro scale. Labor movements in this fashion are on a micro scale national socialist. Like that. That's always what the outcome is. And they're national socialist in a poisonous way as well, because they don't care about generating an underclass in their own society, in their own, as long as it's not happening to their fellow employees or their unionized labor. So like everyone who's a member of the union, they get like they become an identitarian faction themselves, essentially. And the other workers, well, they're stupid for not hooking themselves up into big politics, And so you got big labor, big government, and then the only way to actually make that, because essentially they are leeching on the entire economy at that point. So, yes, they might earn extra wages, and it literally comes at the expense of the rest of the economy. The only way that it doesn't is if you have enough scarcity of labor that everyone has to actually, because then you wouldn't even need unionized because the natural competition in the market would would raise uh, the price of wages. And also, wages are also things that are fundamentally, usually speaking, people are not equally productive, and so usually, if we really had a market, like an intelligent market for labor, you would probably be able to get, I mean, this happens in other industries where people negotiate their salary based on their skills and their experience and their productivity, because these things differ from person to person. And if you actually have, if you don't have, if you have real competition for wages, and you don't have unions doing weird things to the signals, and you have proper incentives in terms of pay structures, and there's transparency. You don't get transparency in terms of competitive salaries if there is no fundamental pressure. For, because if there is a view that there is an oversupply of labor, um, it it's interesting. I wonder. Anyway, what else was I talking about? I was talking a bit about alternative economic systems, or that would have to be set up privately by private organizations that are essentially working towards forging some kind of autarky, some kind of alternative model to the market, which would still operate in the same jurisprudence, sorry, in the same jurisdiction as the market. It would just be, it would still be productive, and in fact, it could still sell things to the market and generate a surplus in the form of, I mean, it could sell things to the market when the price of it was high, so it could also buy things from the market in order to try to accumulate more production capacity, so it could be essentially like a anyway. I mean, there are lots of ways in which systems can work, but if you dislocate yourself from the market, then and you remove market pressures from individuals, then you have to replace that market pressure with some level of responsibility or accountability, in terms of keeping things sustainable. And you know can people follow the rules, and what do you do when people break the rules? Because that's the problem that you have in the current political system, is that when people break the rules, then they still want to be able to enjoy sympathy, which they can demand because of some rationalization and some narrative that they can concoct. And so like, you're not allowed to make people accountable for their own irresponsibility. So if that's the rule, that you can't make people be accountable, except if they're on the other side of the group, or if they're part of the ideological scapegoat that your whole membership or national identity is predicated on. You know, um, this is the general, sort of human condition, which is why I think that, you can't try to make a church out of the world. The world has to stay the world. Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. And you do what you want on the private side, and and you have contract, and you have laws, and you have things that are decentralized. And if you have enough people with integrity, and then they're doing things that in structures and organizations that keep fidelity to basic values and principles, and there are enough individuals participating in those things that really have integrity, then that is how you fix the world. Is by you can't expect society to be good for people. You can't expect society to be better than the people that make it up. And obviously the biggest problem that we have is that if you try to create a general solution to the human condition, if you try to if you want to save the country or something like that, I mean, that's an insoluble problem, because there's always going to be people who are going to be bad. And if you're not capable of excluding them, I mean, what do you do with them? Do you re-educate them? Do you forcefully indoctrinate them? Like, this is the problem with trying to have the state as a church. Like, you can't do that to people. And in fact, to try to have a political project like that is going to be fundamentally inhuman, because it's going to infantilize people, and it's also going to pathologize them when maybe they just need enough independence to learn about the tragedy of their own injustice, or the tragedy of their own uh, uh, self-deception and defects. And yes, you can have people privately who can say, oh, I can diagnose you and I can tell you about what's going on in your head, but you can never force anyone to assimilate that kind of advice or helpfulness. Like, you're going to have to be able to tolerate a world in which, like, things don't always tend towards some progressive goodness or something like that. You can't just assume that people deserve to, that the only thing that ever went wrong was that people didn't have enough collateral support, and they didn't inherit enough when they were born, or they didn't have better neighbors that gave them enough opportunity. You can't keep on saying that there is no such thing as basic individual uh, uh, character and integrity. You can't systematize these things. So yeah, I mean, trying to create a church out of the world and say that the world needs to be redeemed, or the world can be a kind of a unitary church, is a very stupid idea. It's an idea concocted by someone who can't imagine that truth is something that you actually have to understand. It's the imagination that truth is something that you can just participate in, and that other people can condition you into it, and that the problem is just it hasn't been established already as a culture, and and then it would just sort of suck you into it. It's a very inhumane. It has a very insect view of the human being. That we are all just kind of teenagers that didn't have uh, the right support in having our ego being stroked. And I mean, I would argue that maybe it is a lack of parenting to some degree, or a lack of moral stricture, or just basic doctrinal understanding of some basic life facts. And I would argue that a lot of that also has to do with the fact that people are homogenized by structures and by systems that are palpably corrupt, like the American conception of justice is palpably corrupt. I mean, justice doesn't mean anything to an American. I mean, it's a figment. It literally exists as a matter of argument. That's all that justice is in the American system. It doesn't have any deep resonance. The actual structure of law in America itself is pitiful. It's undignified. It's fundamentally corrosive um, to the intellect. Uh, and I mean, this is how sympathy grifting usually starts off, and how poisonous ideology gets off the ground is that you really have such a mixed up system, and you get so dependent on mixing everything up into an emotional peak so that someone can come and sort of and soothe it and settle it. And when does anyone ever pick up the tab of reasoning and understanding? It never comes to bear. It's just always collating and conflating a whole set of uh, spicy, technically sweet buzzwords that come down the pike, and then you kind of whip them into a new concoction. And you just kind of are trying to surf the myriad landscape, because you're trying to find something to install as a control module of the culture. So you're trying to control something that is never meant to be controlled. You're trying to control something that is meant to belong to people and be independent. You're just technically, if you were really a leftist revolutionary, you would want to revolutionize systems and structures and thinking, like on a fundamental level almost. But they're not interested in that. They're not interested in integrity and accountability. They're not interested in things like law. They just are interested in economic relations and some social psychology or bastardization. Because that's what leftist pseudo intellectualism has morphed into. And it's interesting because integral, or what's it called? Yeah, integral theory latched onto this bullshit. I mean, because this is integral theory gave these people another leg. They gave them a crutch. You know, they passed on the baton to go another whole relay with. So they almost gave it the perfect excuse to kind of, I don't know, in integral theory. Am I even saying it right? I mean, I want to say these things, but anyway, I might as well say it in my 3-hour recording. Might as well put it in here. But I mean, I debated with the guy who wrote the book, which I can't remember his name, which is embarrassing. I debated with both of them at the same time, with the guy who is the friend of him, who is the Japanese guy who's always going on about the kaons. We were at a restaurant, and I would debate with him for like 3 weeks. We would go to this restaurant, and I'd debate with him in the courtyard. What was his name? Oh my word. The theory of everything guy. And I debunked his whole thesis, and I even diagnosed exactly the problem with the whole intellectual exercise. I mean, it's and Mark Manson has made the exact same argument against integral theory, and against the whole sort of intellectual project of it. And Jamie Wheel is also incredibly good at at showing just how ineffectual the whole intellectual framework is. You end up saying very trite, stupid things. If you apply these high order, conceptual frameworks, and you apply them to things, you say you end up with the most banal kind of conclusions. things that people have known in management forever. Jamie Will has this perfect description of it. That's the kind of thing that it does. And when it does this, it really thinks to itself that it has the ability to integrate things that are disparate and that are seemingly disconnected, and that they have a way of creating a systematized, one size fits all, like top down view of the puzzle. And it just, I mean, I'm not saying anything that insightful, I guess, now, just giving, but I mean, like, it was very interesting because, it took me a long time when I was debating the guy who came up with this stuff, because, you know, because they literally, I mean, and this is the same thing with left people. They don't listen. They don't actually hear the things that you fucking say. It doesn't penetrate their thick fucking skull. It really, they don't get it, because it doesn't compute. Like, it doesn't help them in their operating program. They are like vampires, and they are addicted, and they can't stop doing what they're like zombies. And if you try to give them a bit of information that breaks their worldview, they're like, no, there's nothing other than zombiedom. There's just, you can just be a zombie, and there are different types of zombies, and there are different types of virus that cause people to become zombies. But which zombie horde are you from? That's the only thing that they can ask you, is but declare which zombie horde that you're advocating on behalf of, because otherwise you're not even in the contest of what's going to be the dead ideology that takes over the world. What's going to be the brainiac sort of cloud morality that everyone hooks up into. And it's just, I mean, integral theory just gave more intellectual sophistication, more complexity, so that people can say that, oh, well, now we've got different words to say the same things with, and they just keep on saying the same fucking bad ideas. It's the same thing in a different clothing, so that it can kind of escape the bad press of the last epoch, of the last promulgation of the same bullshit. It's just Leninism in a new guise. It's just new. It's new window dressing, new propaganda. But I mean, and this is the thing, is that this is what leftism is. It's people who never stopped being teenagers, and then they thought, I'm going to be I'm going to be an intellectual hotshot. It's like, other guys, they have the hot rod, they have the good car, or they're good at sports, and I have my inferiority complex with my intellectual um, prescriptions onto society, that then I can get back at society for whatever psychologically I'm going to project onto it. They make arguments that are so unfounded. They expect to be given their presuppositions. They can't ground them or substantiate them, and they can't even listen to anyone who doesn't agree with their presuppositions. They won't even tolerate it for a second, because that is how brittle their whole intellectual edifice is. It's utterly disgusting. And now they have ways of protecting it now, because they can say, you're not saying the jargon from integral theory, so you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. We're talking about something that you don't have the bus pass to begin to enter into our domain. It's a form of gatekeeping, and so it's a form of keeping the treehouse club. Because if you're an adult, you can't climb up the tree to get into the tree house to tell them, sort of how stupid they're being. What's the other thing here is so yeah, and it's interesting, because that's also what they want, is when they're being entreated or whatever, They want their ego stroked more than they want anything else. That's what they want. They want to be told that their concerns, their vulnerable narcissism is divine or sacred or very, very special, and it is part of the solution, because they can't not conflate their own problems with the problems of the world. They have to project, they have to conflate them into the same political question, because then, so that they can do both at the same time. Because they're essentially, they can't go to church and deal with their own personal problems, or not I think that most churches are terrible because they don't understand proper Christianity, and they don't understand the doctrine, and there's nothing spiritual about them. They're just, anyway. But essentially, in my view of what a church should be, let's just say that they're trying to get that from politics. What is the other thing that I should say is there's two other things that were important. I should. It's interesting. I mean, I was just uh, listening to Andrew Clavin, and he was saying something that I didn't agree with. He was talking about belief in God and taking things from the belief in God. I don't know. I really don't like some of where he was going down in terms of his argument, because he, in some sense, he is also trying to turn politics into a church, or he's trying to turn the law into, safeguarding divine rights and all these sorts of things. I think that's very confused and problematic. But anyway, I've explored how I could perhaps be described as a hypocrite on these matters, because I do have very high standards for what the state should do, but I do see it as a completely secular enterprise, and is secularly justifiable. But essentially, that uh, anyway. Sorry, that's probably not that. I'm a bit confused to add this. Uh, Let me not talk about that. So let me not talk about Andrew Clavin. What should I say? Yeah, so I do think that if the legal system was better in America, for instance, that would actually, and the political system and the justice was properly independent of the political system, and that justice had a form of accountability in it, and the American system really had the rule of law, that offers to people, because people will naturally imprint themselves on a political culture, or at least in terms of however government is delivered to a people, and government usually should hopefully have a branch of the judiciary and a branch of the executive and a branch of the legislature, and that these things should be properly independent of one another, which hasn't been struck in America. But at least America gives us these basic categories and these basic divisions, so we can start to think about them. But the, essentially, I believe that the judiciary has to be supreme over the other branches, and the judiciary must be independent of the other branches. Now, in some sense, these things can never be perfect, because at some point, you have to appoint judges, and so you need a mechanism for putting judges into their position. Hopefully, you would have a culture in which the politicians would not be a part of the decision-making process, but they would send people, high-ranking people in the legal fraternity, because, well, that's how it traditionally was done, in fact, um, is that the senior advocates would amongst themselves decide who the judges should be, essentially. And the seniority defined by talent and by essentially skill and expertise. But that the law itself is wholly independent, and it has its own values and principles, and it can comport itself and contend itself without needing any authorization from the legislature, although the legislature can still freely create regulations, but in fact those regulations have to be incorporated by the legal system. They have to be assimilated by the legal system through essentially a constitution, preeminently guiding how the legislature interfaces with the judiciary, but that judicial officers are not secretaries of the legislature. They do not carry out the will of the legislature. They have to act in accordance with the Constitution and with the law itself. And the legislature is not the prime source of law. The legislature itself fulfills a role within the constitutional order, and it is not superior to the Constitution. And so also I think that in our system, in the South African system, people don't understand this, but I do believe that this is actually how it works. So I would call myself a South African constitutional originalist and supremacist, in that you cannot amend the Constitution to negate things in the Constitution. You cannot have things removed from the Constitution. You can only add things to it, or you can maybe elaborate, but you cannot reduce the guarantees and the rights in the Constitution. To do so would be fundamentally unconstitutional, and it would have to at least pass through the limitations clause in the Constitution. So if you wanted to change the Constitution, that tentative change would have to be considered very strictly against the subclauses in the limitations clause. And I do think that no limitation, no reduction would ever be justifiable. So anyway, and America has something like that in terms of its Bill of Rights, that you can't actually destroy something in the Bill of Rights. You have to cross it out and add something new. And then what you crossed out is actually always there. It's just de facto, it's been sectioned out by a further amendment. But this is much better because in this sense it's actually substantive. In the South African sense, it's not just leaving a historical record of itself in terms of the mistakes that it's made. In the South African constitutional framework, everything is substantively etched in stone in the Republic, and it's independent of politics anywhere. And using that as a benchmark and as a standard of accountability and integrity and values, then you can actually see what's going on, and you can see how people are trying to move the goalposts and scapegoat and do weird political things, and you can actually stop yourself from being gaslighted. You can stop people from trying to promulgate democratic illiteracy and stop people from actually promoting racialist demagoguery and other forms of disgusting anti-constitutional propaganda. Then you actually have something that can defend itself against illiberalism. But that's all been betrayed because we have political plants in the Constitutional Court that have essentially undermined the constitutional supremacy, and they've actually imported a disgusting kind of American jurisprudence into the South African system. They've actually invented a governmental prerogative in our constitutional law, which has actually destroyed the fundamental constitutional law. in my country. It's very disgusting. It's very Nazi-esque. I mean, this is exactly what the legal positivism that was used by uh, the Nazis, and the kind of legal positivism which the American system is also prone to, although they have some lines in the sand which are ostensibly there because of the Constitutional Bill of Rights, but that's just a work of how do you square these circles? How do you rationalize the words to give them some effect? Is basically what it amounts to. That's the only protection that it ends up amounting to, because they're not expected to actually really work at a fundamentally deep level. You just have to give some effect to them. Generally, it's quite a low bar. The rationalization that goes on in the American Supreme Court is quite undignified. It really hurts the mind itself how political their courts are, because in some sense the law itself is a political project. It has no deep independent grounding in itself in values and principles. Its principles are all produced by the democracy. It's all relative to the democracy. It's very disgusting. And so, I mean, there at least it makes sense. It's self-consistent for the American system to have a governmental prerogative. But there is no governmental prerogative in South Africa. We have a supreme constitution, although it's been betrayed. Anyway, let me stop moaning and whining. So, I'm bemoaning these things because this is the general solution to the problem that we currently face ourselves. This is the problem that the world sits with, that is already solved by the South African system. Only it's been betrayed and gutted because of this poisonous cultural atmosphere and corruption that has turned our constitutional framework and our legal order and our liberal order into a banana republic, into a tin pot, kind of backwater African, joke, like we are like the lawless countries that just have more institutional structure and more lip service to pay to things which are in the process of being demolished by politicians, as they say things like the Constitution is getting in the way of government, and they keep on gaslighting us, and they keep on assaulting the courts and assaulting the independence of the courts, and as they have, as they have played this game of attrition so that they can institute black fascism, essentially, or solidarity to the black identity and racial consciousness, which is, the new thing that's demolishing us all. But maybe if that does come to pass, then afterwards the world will wake up, because we'll realize, oh, black people can be fascists too, black people can be Nazis too. So, maybe it'll be good for the world. Maybe this is what we need, because we can't actually think about things anymore. But at some point, the lack of courage and the kind of the evil social commentators that exist, and how no one criticizes them because of the viral groupthink that is so good at punishing people for not conforming to their virtue signaling and their low-grade racism. Maybe it is just a lack of, maybe not enough people understand and know that they understand, and know that other people understand that they can actually hook up together with saying the right, agree to the right things, to say, okay, well, we'll actually have each other's back, and we'll create a cultural core, and we won't be gaslighted by all these fascists all over the place, and these wannabe authoritarians and censors. Because that's, at some point you have to start calling them the racists. You have to start calling these race baiting fascists. You have to say, no, you're the racist. Shut up. Like, we don't want you part of our institution. We don't want you part of our organization. You shouldn't be teaching children anything. You should be, in the South African context, you're promoting anti-constitutional propaganda. but instead we have, man, these ENTP radio hosts who are, there's something about ENTPs. They love concocting manipulative narratives and constructing intellectual worldviews, which then they police and that they kind of purity test, and they're very good at cherry picking elements of things to comport to their worldview. I mean, I was listening to someone complain that Rob Malone, who invented the RMNA technology that created the vaccines, that I had a whole recording about this, which I never uploaded, just complaining about how this guy on the radio just went on and on and on about Rob Malone in the most intellectually dishonest way, creating a false dichotomy that that basically, well, if you they always you know they always equate that if you are vaccine hesitant and you don't want vaccines to go to healthy young people because we don't know anything about the long-term side effects of the vaccines, but somehow that's like a non-issue. That is an issue that can't even be thought about as existing. To even, so you just conflate every vaccine hesitant person with an anti-vaxxer. That they're all just anti-vax people because they don't want essentially what is an experimental, what in fact shouldn't even be called a vaccine. I mean, to call this a vaccine, I mean, it doesn't stop you from getting it. It's almost like a preemptive treatment. It doesn't stop you from spreading it. It doesn't stop you from getting it. It's like, I mean, you have to be semantically gaslighted, and you're so conditioned that you can't actually break their narrative because they've got such a hold on the narrative. It's so disgusting how little journalists have been doing their fucking job. And then they cover themselves by doubling down on this precautionary, hysterical moral outrage on forcing people to side with them in terms of the narrative crackdown by leveraging these false dichotomies and falsely reducing and cherry picking people's arguments. So he attacked Rob Malone for saying that, he said that people authorized the vaccine much too quickly. That's the beginning of Rob Malone's argument as to all the things that have gone wrong. That is the first thing that happened, which then led on to all these other things. The suppression of therapeutics, because if you actually have an alternative treatment, then you can't get emergency authorization. Doesn't even mention that on the radio. He just basically says Rob Malone is being hosted by people who are anti-vaxxers, and he's been given a platform by people who are anti-vaxxers. Doesn't mention any of his actual arguments. He only says the first thing in the beginning of Rob Malone's, sort of. So I mean, in some sense, you can see what this radio person is trying to do. He's trying to immunize people from the counter narrative, from any alternative narrative, because that is the gateway to the alternative narrative. So if you hear Rob Malone and you hear that first link in the chain that, oh, the authorization was given too quickly, that you'll already turn off so that you won't listen to the vaccine hesitant, which then get falsely conflated and generalized as just being anti-vax. Very good reasons to not uptake an experimental vaccine, which we don't know the long-term side effects of, for a respiratory disease, which, like, by definition, is going to be endemic. Even if it's not going to be a pandemic, it's going to be endemic. So, and it's a respiratory disease. You are going to come across it at some point. So the question is, when do you want to come across it? And how is your immunity going to be in the long term if all you're immune to is spike, if your immune system is only good at combating the spike protein, when it might mutate, and COVID viruses mutate incredibly quickly, and so it's a bit insane to think that so you're going to take a vaccine that doesn't even help eliminate the virus. It doesn't do that. And this is a virus that is going to mutate. There are just so many inconsistencies with the public health response. The public health strategy has got so many problems with it. I mean, like, yes, there are some simple heuristics that, well, the vaccine means that there'll be less pressure on ICU wards. Or we don't exactly know that as well, because the Delta variant was the least severe and the most contagious. So I guess we won't know what the counter history would have been if we didn't have a vaccine and we got sorry, not did I say Delta? I meant Omicron. So if we get to the Omicron variant, in some alternative history or some alternative universe, I guess we won't know what the figures would have been like in that alternative universe, but we probably would have gotten a much better kind of herd immunity a lot faster if we allowed healthy people to not quarantine, like the Great Barrington Declaration suggested, where those other epidemiologists had a completely alternative public health strategy even before we had the vaccine. I think they came up with that before we had the vaccine. And then we would have minimized the exposure of the vulnerable population, because we would have achieved a higher rate of herd immunity, and therefore we would have minimized exposure to the vulnerable population. Whereas by prolonging the pandemic, we have actually extended exposure to the vulnerable by slowing down the acquisition of herd immunity. And also, if we had achieved herd immunity faster, we probably also would have gotten the COVID virus to mutate faster, which would have essentially likely facilitated the natural progression in these things is a weaker strain, or at least a less symptomatic strain, and also a more contagious one. Those are, generally speaking, I mean, those are the selective pressures for a virus. But, I mean, essentially the crisis that we have suffered with is essentially the hubris of people who have selectively chosen to manage very stupid facets that are presented by the kind of public health problem that this virus is, and they chose to go with the lowest common denominator: identity politics, systemic oppression interpretation. I think that because journalists were already radicalized by identity politics, they assimilated and framed COVID in the same way that they do, it's the same kind of way that they treat Black Lives Matter. Essentially they were radicalized by Black Lives Matter, so that when they thought about the COVID-19 virus, they did the same thing. That they trotted out that, well, if you don't go with the lowest common denominator solution, then you're a help-killing grandmother. You're killing people's grandparents if you don't support all of the mandates. no weighing between freedom and personal liberty, and some kind of trotting out some sympathy case of, oh well, what about the people who can't get the vaccine because of other reasons, and now we must all do our best in order to protect the most vulnerable, even if that ends up prolonging their exposure to the pandemic because of slowing down the acquisition of herd immunity and getting this into a much more manageable endemic sort of phase. And also, I do think that there has been a suppression of therapeutics, because it's politically there's been an incentive for that, but also, let's say, big pharma has had an incentive for that, and it helps conform with the formula of how people who are virtue signaling with this issue uh, need it to work. And so, in some sense, I think it's a very useful dry run for. In some sense, it's a microcosm of the same leftist hyperbole or hyperbolic reduction, and it's a microcosm of the identity politics distortion of reality and dishonest dishonest reduction and generalization, the sloppy moral generalizations that go into crafting that kind of narrative. Anyway,